Hello everyone, it's Shannon here for Honeybee Stamps. In today's video, we are going to combine the Emboss Resist technique with stencils. That's actually how we got this dark background, but still have light flowers, or actually white flowers, and light leaves. The stencils we are using today is the Daisy Lattice stencils. There are 3 stencils in this set. They are each labeled. This one here happens to be the flower centers. They're labeled at the top. That's how you know what it ink blends, and also how you know which is front. I'm going to start with the stencil for the leaves. I'm just going to center the stencil over an A2 panel of white cardstock, and then I'm going to ink blend with Distress Oxide. I'm going to start with Salvaged Patina, and I'm just going to do a nice simple flat blend of Salvaged Patina over all the openings in this stencil. Once I finish ink blending with this Salvaged Patina, we're going to do a little gradation. I have the Shader 1 brush here. It's just a small blending brush, and I'm going to ink blend at kind of the base of the leaves where the leaves would meet the flowers with Evergreen Bough, which is kind of like a darker green. This is just going to add a little bit of depth to our leaves. I love doing this. It's pretty subtle, but I definitely think it's worth the little extra effort. It adds in another layer of color, and again, like I mentioned, it adds some depth. Once I finish with that little gradation of Evergreen Bough, I'm going to grab a dry towel. I'm using a microfiber towel, but even a paper towel would work, and I'm going to clean off the stencil. Once I finish cleaning off the stencil, we are going to grab some clear embossing and watermark ink, and then I'm going to ink blend over the stencil with this clear embossing ink. This should help for our embossing powder to really stick to this layer or all these leaves. We might be able to get away with it just because we used oxides to not do this step, to not do the embossing and watermark ink, but just to be safe, I would recommend doing this final ink blend of the embossing and watermark ink before you dip it into your clear embossing powder. You definitely want to use clear here so you don't cover up all that beautiful colored ink that we ink blended. So I'm just dipping my panel into that clear embossing powder, and now we're going to heat set. Once we heat set this, the powder will melt, obviously, and then it will trap and protect that ink underneath. So when we eventually get to ink blending the background with our dark ink, that will all those areas, all those leaves will still stay that nice, beautiful Salvaged Patina and Evergreen Bough color. Now we're moving on to our next stencil. This is the stencil for the flowers. I'm going to center this or get it lined up with the leaves. Once I get it lined up, I'll use a couple pieces of tape to kind of hold it in place. This layer, we are not going to actually use any colored ink. We're going to just go straight to our clear embossing and watermark ink and ink blend all of our openings. And you definitely want to be kind of heavy-handed because this is the only layer we're doing. We're not layering it on top of any Distress Oxides like we did previously with the leaves. So you definitely need a healthy layer of that clear embossing and watermark ink. Then of course I'll dip it into some clear embossing powder, and then I will heat set with my heat tool. And this is actually going to be the white flowers. I know you can't really see right now. Maybe the camera will catch some of the panel will catch some of the light, but all those flowers have now been heat set in clear, and they will remain white. Now we're on to the last stencil. This is the stencil for the flower centers. I got it lined up, and then I'm going to start by ink blending with Mustard Seed Distress Oxide, and I'll just ink blend all the openings with this beautiful yellow. Once I finish with the yellow, I will then actually do a little gradation. I have Spiced Marmalade here. I'm going to grab another shader brush and just add a little bit of this orange to the sides of the flower centers. Even the teeny tiny little flowered centers, I just do the best I can for those. They're pretty small. But just adding that tiny bit of orange, a little touch of orange, again adds some depth and just introduces a nice new color and just makes this background overall more interesting. Then I will clean my stencil, and then after we get it all clean with this dry towel, we're going to ink blend with our clear embossing and watermark ink one more time. And again, this is just to really make sure that clear embossing powder sticks nicely to those flower centers. So now I'm just going to dip my panel into my clear embossing powder, and then we'll be ready to heat set with our heat tool. once we finish heat setting those flower centers, we are actually ready to ink blend the background. This is the really exciting part. This is where all that hard work really pays off. I'm ink blending this background with Pine Needle's Distress ink, and you can see that dark green is really starting to make those, the embossing powder is resisting that dark ink, and you can really start to see those beautiful flowers start to pop, which they were not even visible before. It's so fun to watch, to kind of watch this process and just have those flowers revealed. It's really cool. And I chose to use Distress ink rather than Oxide just because I think the ink is a little bit more intense, a little bit darker than the Pine Needle's Distress Oxide. So that's the only reason why I chose the ink over the Oxide. Then I'll just clean my panel, clean off that those heat embossed areas with the towel to remove any of that excess ink, and we're actually done with that panel. We're now going to move on to the Daisy Layers Bouquet. We're going to use this just to kind of create like a little focal point for our card, but a subtle focal point, so the sentiment's actually a little bit easier to read. I stamped them in clear embossing and watermark ink onto some vellum, and then I've dipped it into white embossing powder, and now I'll heat set with my heat tool. After I heat set these flowers, I then will grab the Daisy Layering Bouquet honey cuts, grab that coordinating die, line it up, and then die cut those flowers with my die cutting machine, and that will complete kind of our vellum focal point. Now we're going to move on to our sentiment. I have the Big Time Kindness stamp set here. I'm going to grab Hello Friend and stamp it in intense black ink onto some white cardstock. After I've stamped my sentiment a couple times to make sure it's dark and crisp, I then will die cut it out using the Big Time Kindness honey cuts or coordinating dies. I'll line up the die, run it through my die cutting machine, and we'll have this perfectly die cut sentiment. I just love the scale of these sentiments. Now I'm moving on back to, I should say, to the Big Time Kindness for a sub-sentiment. Love this combo of that big scripty sentiment with a linear sentiment. It's just my favorite kinds of sentiments. I did apply some anti-static powder, stamped the sentiment in embossing and watermark ink onto some black cardstock, and then I dipped it into some white embossing powder. Then I'll heat set with my heat tool, and then I'll trim that sentiment down to a strip off camera. Now we're ready to kind of bring this whole card together. I'm going to start by adhering this panel to our card front. I did off camera trim this panel down a little bit so we had a tiny border on all the sides of the panel, so you can see a little bit of that white card base that we adhered it on. Then I'm going to move on to those vellum flowers. Going to add a little bit of that liquid adhesive to the flower centers where it's kind of hidden and place it down. I don't want to totally glue these flowers completely flat. I like the little bit of like ruffled edges that the vellum has because it doesn't lay completely flat. I like that little bit of dimension. I've went ahead and added foam adhesive to the backside of my Hello Friend, and I've removed the backing and stuck it down, and then I will finish with my sub-sentiment, which I also added foam adhesive to, and stick that right under my Hello Friend, and that will actually complete the card. I'll hold it to the camera here so you can get a good look at this really beautiful background. I love this technique. I just think it yields such cool results, and for sure people will be wondering, how did you do that? Because it's just so surprising to see a stamped card with a dark background. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If you have any questions about the products I use, please check out the links below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.